By the end of the presentation, I hope you'll be able to answer the following 5 questions about radiofrequency radiation and know some simple ways that you can reduce your own exposure. The questions are: what is radiofrequency radiation? How are we exposed to it? What are some of the health effects, especially regarding tumor risk or cancer? What is the role of government, or what the role of government should be and the role of industry should be? And then at the very end, I'll give you some personal safety tips and some links to some more information about that. Although I'll focus on the tumor risks from cell phone radiation, I'll briefly discuss more common health risks of wireless radiation and the implications for 5G, which is the 5th generation of cellular technology. Some of my slides are quite dense, so don't try to read them in real time. The slide set is available on my website right after this session's over, along with many more resources on this topic. I've been disseminating the research since roughly 2011. Since the first commercially available cell phone was introduced in 1983, we've seen 5 generations of cell phone technology. Over the past 3 decades, the public has been exposed to increasing amounts of radio frequency or wireless radiation from multiple sources, including cell phones and cell towers, cordless phones and Wi-Fi routers, computers, laptops, and tablets, wireless baby monitors and wireless security systems, smart televisions, smart thermostats, smart household appliances, and smart utility meters, as well as conventional, hybrid, and electric motor vehicles. All are sources of radio frequency radiation nowadays. The electromagnetic spectrum includes all types of electromagnetic fields arrayed by the frequency or length of the waves. On the far right are the highest frequency and smallest waves, which are considered ionizing, for example, X-rays. This radiation has sufficient energy to displace electrons from their orbits, causing an atom to become charged or ionized, which can directly cause chemical changes and DNA damage. Ionizing radiation has been considered carcinogenic since the 1930s. On the far left are extremely low frequency waves that oscillate up to 3,000 cycles per second, which are also called hertz, H-E-R-T-Z. These waves can produce strong magnetic fields. Radio waves occur at higher frequencies, and the highest frequency radio waves are called microwaves. Cell phones and cordless phones are two-way radios that transmit microwaves. Cell phones can emit up to 2 watts of power. In contrast, a microwave oven can emit 1,000 watts or more. Whereas an oven has sufficient power to significantly heat tissue, cell phones generally do not, except perhaps when held next to the body or head. Along with cell towers, wireless devices emit microwaves that are modulated and pulsed to encode voice and data. Also, the systems that power these devices emit low-frequency electromagnetic fields, also called EMF, which has been classified possibly carcinogenic or group 2B since 2001. Radio frequency radiation has been classified possibly carcinogenic or group 2B since 2011. A smartphone typically has 4 or 5 different types of microwave transmitters, including several different cellular technologies, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth, and can have as many as 30 antennas. Some transmitters operate at multiple frequencies, and some can operate simultaneously with others, exposing users to a complex mixture of radiation. The 4 federal agencies depicted in this slide have or had authority to regulate radiofrequency radiation to protect our health. However, they have largely abdicated this responsibility. The main trade association representing the telecommunications industry in the U.S. is the CTIA. This group lobbies at all levels of government, engages in legal battles, and meets with the FCC about 500 times a year. According to Open Secrets, in 2023, the telecom industry spent $117 million on lobbying at the federal level, 60% more than the oil and gas industry and 4 times the tobacco industry's expenditure. The telecom industry has spent $1 billion lobbying just during the past decade. In 1996, the FCC adopted industry guidelines that limit the intensity of radiofrequency radiation exposure. These limits were designed to prevent significant heating of tissue from short-term exposure to wireless radiation, that is, thermal effects. The limits were not designed to protect us from long-term exposure to low-intensity radiofrequency radiation. Although our government demands conclusive evidence before changing the RF exposure limits, it has failed to fund the research needed to develop protective safety standards. In response to a lawsuit filed by a coalition of health groups, the D.C. Federal Appeals Court ruled in August 2021 that before the FCC can reaffirm the 1996 exposure limits, the agency must carefully review the 11,000 pages of evidence that was submitted to ensure that the limits protect human health. The FCC has yet to comply with this court order, although it was issued 3 years ago. Many countries have adopted exposure limits similar to the U.S. The World Health Organization has promoted these limits based upon recommendations of ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. ICNIRP is a self-selected group, many of whom depend on industry for much of their research funding. ICNIRP has been accused of groupthink by Professor Emeritus James Lynn, an international expert and former member of the Commission. I'll give you a few moments to look at this little comic. In the late 1990s, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was monitoring our exposure to RF radiation in the U.S. and conducting research in its laboratories that found evidence of genotoxicity from low levels of exposure. However, unfortunately, Congress terminated the EPA's funding for research in this area, ending the EPA's oversight of wireless technology. The FDA, recognizing that the FCC exposure limits only protected against short-term heating effects, called for, quote-unquote, a significant research effort and recommended in 1999 to the NIH that the National Toxicology Program, or NTP, research the carcinogenicity of cell phone radiation. Except for this $30 million cell phone radiation study conducted by the NTP, the NIH has funded little research over the past decades. After overcoming numerous obstacles, the NTP study was completed in 2018, believe it or not, 19 years after the FDA nominated the study. The NTP study found that 2 years of exposure to cell phone radiation yielded clear evidence, quote unquote, in male rats of increased cancer of the heart and, quote, some evidence, unquote, of increased brain and adrenal gland tumors. Results were equivocal regarding increased tumor incidence observed in female rats and mice of both sexes. The NTP noted that the results can't be directly applied to humans as the amount of exposure was greater than typical cell phone users receive. Although the NTP had indicated that it would continue to research the effects of cell phone radiation once the original study was completed, This year, they announced that it had abandoned this research, and we haven't seen any subsequent studies published since the few follow-up papers from the original study. The NTP has not explained why this critical research was terminated. Of most importance is the fact that the NTP's randomized controlled trial proves that cell phone radiation can cause cancer without significantly heating tissue. This means the FDA should conduct a formal risk assessment and direct the FCC to strengthen its exposure limits, which were designed to protect us only from heating effects. The NTP study also found DNA damage in the brains of mice and rats of both sexes, increased degeneration in the hearts of male and female rats, and decreased birth weight in rats exposed prenatally. The overall likelihood of cancer in male rats was greatest in the middle exposure group, not the highest. Even the lowest exposure group displayed greater incidence of non-malignant tumors compared to the control group. The NTP results regarding heart and brain tumors were reproduced in a large study of male rats conducted in Italy by the Ramazzini Institute using much lower intensity exposures than the NTP. Moreover, the NTP study was not the first to find increased tumor risk caused by microwave radiation. A $5 million U.S. Air Force study found that 18% of male rats exposed to low-intensity microwave radiation developed tumors as compared to only 5% of rats in the control group. Thus, increased cancer risk can occur at levels much lower than the threshold of harm upon which the FCC exposure limits are based. That threshold, by the way, is 4 watts per kilogram. In spite of this evidence, and by the way, the Ramazzini Institute study found the effects at 0.1 watt per kilogram, far below the threshold of harm that current national and international limits have been based upon. In spite of this evidence, the FDA dismissed the NTP study and has refused to conduct a formal risk assessment, even though the NTP is generally considered the gold standard of toxicology testing. Now let's look at some other research on wireless radiation health effects, including biologic studies. So how can RF radiation hurt us without heating? A review of 100 studies of low-intensity exposure to RF radiation reported that 93 studies found significant evidence of oxidative stress, an imbalance between free radicals and antioxidants, which can damage organs and tissues. The harmful effects disrupt cell signaling and induce stress proteins, increase free radical formation and DNA damage, which increases the risk of cancer and neurologic disorders. The exposures in these studies did not induce significant heating. Yet Ickner and others who dismissed these studies argue there is no possible mechanism for wireless radiation to harm organisms other than heating. They ignore or inappropriately dismiss studies that shed light on the mechanisms responsible for the adverse effects from low-intensity exposures. By the way, much of the effects of ionizing radiation are indirect effects, very much like those that we're seeing from non-ionizing radiation, such as wireless radiation. Professor Henry Lai, University of Washington, who's now emeritus, has compiled research summaries on the biologic effects of EMF exposure since 1990. He has found that the preponderance of evidence published in peer-reviewed journals indicates that RF radiation is harmful. More than 1,000 studies have found evidence of oxidative stress and free radical generation, genetic effects, including DNA damage, reproductive harm, or neurological disorders. The most consistent evidence from studies of tumor risk in humans finds that heavy, long-term cell phone use is associated with increased risk of two types of brain tumors: glioma, a malignant tumor in the glial cells, and acoustic neuroma, a non-malignant tumor of the Schwann cells on the main nerve from the ear to the brain. Glial cells and Schwann cells have a similar function. They produce myelin, a protective coating on the nerve cells. Some studies also found evidence of increased risk of meningioma, a mostly non-malignant tumor in the tissue covering the brain. Here are some images of the three types of tumors as they might appear in a scan. In 2020, my colleagues and I updated our 2009 research review that examined the association between cell phone use and tumor risk in case control studies. The results were similar, but based on twice as many studies. The bottom line, in 8 of the studies with 1,000 or more hours of call time on a cell phone, or about 17 minutes per day over a 10-year period, we found a significant 60% increase in tumor risk in the brain or salivary glands. Soon after our study was published, several members of ICNR submitted letters to the journal's editor that criticized our study. However, we were able to successfully defend our study in 2 peer-reviewed letters that were published in the journal. There's a link on my website to the original article and all the letters that followed, and also the peer reviewers' comments, which supported our position. ICNR dismisses the research that shows harmful effects from radiofrequency radiation, and they and their colleagues argue there is no evidence in cancer registries of increases in brain tumor incidence. Many tumors, however, may go unreported to cancer registries for various reasons. In the US, few studies have investigated whether there have been increases in certain types of brain tumors or in specific population subgroups. Although glioma incidence has been stable overall in adults, there is evidence of increases in glioblastoma, the most common and most serious malignant brain tumor. There's also evidence in many other countries of increases in brain tumors of various sorts, in various subgroups, and in various locations of the brain. An alarming trend that has been ignored is the fact that in the US, from 2004 to 2021, the overall age-adjusted incidence of non-malignant meningioma, which happens to be the most common brain tumor, increased 73%, from 6.6 to 11.4 per 100,000. This is based on SEER22 data from NCI. 73% increase in that period of time, unexplained. And furthermore, we have seen increases in brain tumor incidence among children and young adults. Clearly, more research is needed to understand these increases in tumor incidence. Children's brains are rapidly developing, making them more susceptible to adverse effects from wireless radiation. A young child's brain absorbs twice the radiation from a cell phone compared to an adult's brain, and 10 times the marrow than in the adult's brain. Testing procedures required to certify cell phones for sale, do not account for these differences in RF radiation. We've known for several decades that microwave radiation affects the thyroid gland. Like many other nations, the US has seen a doubling of thyroid cancer incidence in recent years. Although this could be due to better screening, recent studies suggest that cell phone radiation may be contributing to this increase. A Yale Medical School study found elevated thyroid cancer incidence among long-term cell phone users. Although the risk estimates in this small study were of borderline significance, a follow-up study found that genetic susceptibility increases the association between cell phone use and thyroid cancer, making a number of significant correlations. That is, RF radiation may affect some people more than others depending on their genetic makeup. An interesting graphic on this slide shows that as the cell phone evolved, the key antenna moved from the top of the phone to the bottom of the phone, exposing the neck area to the greatest radiation as opposed to the temporal lobe of the brain. Research on humans suggests the following additional health risks from cell phone use: increased tumor risk in other areas of the head and neck, including the salivary and pituitary glands and in the female breast, sperm damage and reduced male fertility, increased incidence of miscarriage and preterm births, an increased incidence of headaches, hearing problems, impaired memory, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder from prenatal and early childhood exposures to cell phone radiation. It's estimated that 3 to 5% of the population suffer from electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or EHS, an environmental intolerance, which may result in headaches, memory impairment, fatigue, insomnia, ringing of the ears, heart palpitations, and other symptoms. EHS is controversial due to difficulty in diagnosing this syndrome. Numerous studies have shown that people with EHS cannot tell when they are exposed to RF radiation. These results are used to argue that the syndrome is not caused by the radiation. However, these studies seem inappropriate because they assume that individuals should be immediately aware of the exposure. But like many other allergies, there's often a lag between exposure and symptoms. According to Physicians Weekly, EHS is, quote, a clinical syndrome characterized by the presence of a wide spectrum of nonspecific multiple organ symptoms. They go on to say many hypersensitive patients appear to have impaired detoxification systems that become overloaded by excessive oxidative stress. Essentially, the body's responding to multiple stressors, including many different forms of EMF and many chemical exposures that are toxic. And there's quite a bit of overlap between people who experience EHS and multiple chemical sensitivity. A recent review of studies on the effects of cell towers in urban areas found harmful effects on people's health. 3/4 of the 39 studies reported effects including radiofrequency sickness, or EHS, and cancer. Reviews on Environmental Health, the journal, published 3 papers which examined the effects on plants and animals of non-ionizing EMF, including RF radiation. These papers cited more than 1,200 references. The authors concluded that current levels of EMF exposure have harmful effects on many wildlife species. In 2018, the CTIA launched the Global Race to 5G, an advertising campaign to promote the adoption of 5G in the US, framing this primarily as a competition with China. I'll give you a few moments to read the comic strip. In 2018, Scientific American published on its website an opinion piece by a bioengineering professor who argued that there is little risk of danger from 5G since it will comply with FCC exposure limits that protect against quote-unquote excessive heating of tissue. Scientific American, with some prodding, published my rebuttal on its website. My key points included: 1, the FCC exposure limits are based on a few studies involving small numbers of animals. 2, the FCC limits protect us from short-term heating risk, but not from low-intensity effects or from long-term exposure. 3rd, more than 500 studies found adverse effects from low-intensity RF exposure. Although no study had tested 5G, we had sufficient evidence to delay the rollout of 5G until we could establish its safety. Finally, in a U.S. Senate hearing with the FCC, Senator Richard Blumenthal concluded that we are, quote unquote, flying blind regarding the health and safety of 5G. 5G cellular technology employs different low and mid-band microwave frequencies than were previously used. Also, for the first time, this technology employs millimeter waves, which are high-frequency microwaves. Millimeter waves behave differently than microwaves. Although they can move large amounts of data at high rates, they travel by line of sight, and the signals are blocked by buildings and foliage. Thus, the telecom industry must install hundreds of thousands of small cell towers to deploy this technology near where we live, work, and play. Millimeter wave radiation is largely absorbed by the skin, the sweat glands, the peripheral nerves, the eyes, and the testes. They don't penetrate the body as well as the lower frequencies. These waves can induce or inhibit cell death, enhance or suppress cell growth, and can alter cell membranes. The radiation can cause hypersensitivity and alter the immune and circulatory systems, the heart, liver, brain, and kidneys through secondary effects. It can harm insects and promote growth of drug-resistant pathogens. The next slide summarizes the results of a recent review on the effects of millimeter waves on the head and neck region. In this review, 10 of the 24 studies of millimeter wave effects on the head and neck found harmful effects on cells and tissues. Since these effects were not likely caused by heating, governments should acknowledge the potential harm of non-thermal mechanisms. The authors of this review called for a moratorium on the deployment of 5G. The few studies published to date on 5G report numerous adverse effects. Although these studies use carrier frequencies commonly used with 5G, mostly low and mostly actually mid-band frequencies, microwave frequencies, by the way. Most studies did not actually use the 5G modulation or key features of 5G. Most of these were continuous wave studies, so they're not totally relevant. Many scientists believe that the complex modulation used in 5G along with these new features are likely to exacerbate the biologic activity and potential harm. Yet, despite the fact that they were using continuous wave frequencies, most of these studies found adverse effects in a variety of systems, including the neuroendocrine system, the cardiovascular system. It also had effects on sleep quality, sperm quality, bone quality, gene expression, and sensory motor responses. Ideally, research should be funded to develop scientific consensus about RF health effects. Go back a slide. So governments can adopt safety limits that protect public and environmental health. However, governments have increased the scientific controversy by supporting researchers, industry-friendly researchers who deny that low-intensity exposure can be harmful and defend our inadequate RF exposure guidelines. 2011, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, convened 31 scientists to review the research on RF radiation in cancer. Based upon their review of the science, these experts classified RF radiation as possibly carcinogenic to humans, noting among heavy users an increased risk of glioma and acoustic neuroma. Since 2011, hundreds of studies have found harmful biologic effects, including DNA damage and cancer. 8 years later, IARC convened an expert advisory group to prioritize agents to be reviewed. The experts recommended that RF radiation be re-reviewed by 2024 because many scientists who researched this believe that IARC should upgrade the classification of RF radiation as a carcinogen from possibly carcinogenic to at least probably carcinogenic. However, IARC has postponed this review to wait for a WHO review of all the health risks. In the meantime, ICNIRP and key staff in IARC and the WHO have been supportive of industry-friendly researchers who defend the current RF exposure limits. Since 2015, more than 250 EMF scientists who have published over 2,000 papers on EMF and health have signed the International EMF Scientist Appeal, which calls for stronger regulation of RF radiation. It's not easy to get a large group of scientists to come to consensus, so we were quite pleased to see that this many of our colleagues were willing to make this pretty powerful statement about the research and call for investigation of the current exposure limits, both nationally and internationally. In 2017, more than 400 scientists and medical doctors concerned about the potential health risks of 5G submitted a petition to the European Commission calling for a moratorium on the rollout of this new technology. About 100 of the EMF scientists signed this petition as well. In 2021, the EMF scientists who endorsed the International EMF Scientist Appeal commissioned a new organization, the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, commonly called ICBE-EMF. The purpose is to make recommendations based on the best peer-reviewed science. The Commission is dedicated to ensuring the protection of all species from the harmful effects of non-ionizing radiation. ICNIRP, by the way, is only focusing on human species. They don't take into account any other species. In 2023, we conducted a webinar at the Royal Society of Medicine that contested the validity of RF radiation safety limits. This webinar is available online at the ICBE-EMF website. We have also published 4 peer-reviewed papers to date. Here's their titles and links to the papers. They're all open access papers. Let me briefly describe the 4 papers. Our first paper demonstrates how the FCC and ICNIRP ignored or inappropriately dismissed hundreds of scientific studies that found adverse health effects below the threshold exposure which these agencies use to establish RF exposure limits. Our second paper proposes 6 simple, mostly software and some hardware engineering fixes that could dramatically reduce cell phone radiation. Given the growing evidence of health effects from cell phone and cell tower radiation, it's time for the telecom industry to compete on product safety. Industry will argue this is unnecessary and will be costly, but car makers said the same thing when the public demanded safer cars. Today, car makers compete on safety. Industry does not need to wait for government regulation to improve product safety. Our third paper addresses major problems with the COSMOS study of brain tumor risk from cell phone use. COSMOS is a major 25 to 30-year cohort study investigating the health effects of long-term use of mobile phones. Our paper calls for a retraction of the paper's conclusions and demands that the data set be made available to investigators who have no ties to industry. For one, this was an interim paper. It was premature to actually look at the tumor risk in this particular study. Our fourth paper addresses major problems with one of the systematic health risk reviews that has been commissioned by the WHO. In 2012, the WHO launched a project to assess the risks of radiofrequency radiation for an upcoming monograph on the topic. The initial effort was dropped because the flawed process generated considerable controversy. The project was restarted in 2019. 10 teams were selected to review the research on different outcomes associated with wireless radiation. Unfortunately, each team included at least one member of ICNIRP, whose mission is to promote ICNIRP's industry-friendly RF exposure limits. Of great concern to my colleagues and myself, my ICBE EMF colleagues, is that all 9 of the WHO-sponsored systematic reviews published to date in a special issue of Environmental International suffer from serious methodologic problems and seem biased to dismiss the substantial evidence of health risks reported in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. Earlier this month, the WHO Commission review of human cancer studies was published online. The paper received worldwide media attention because the paper's first author, who also happens to be the vice chair of ICNIRP, proclaimed in a press release, quote, "We can now be more confident that exposure to radio waves from mobile phones or wireless technologies is not associated with an increased risk of brain cancer," unquote, and that, quote, "radio waves from wireless technologies are not a hazard to human health," unquote. Numerous problems with this paper are discussed on my saferemr.com website. The most informative results should have come from analyses of the tumor risk associated with the total amount of time on cell phone calls. The study found that after about 500 hours of cell phone call time, the risk of glioma and meningioma increased with increased call time. However, these results were not statistically significant, we believe, for 2 reasons. The authors employed a complex model with limited power to detect effects, and the original studies had relatively few users with substantial call time. In contrast, in our 2020 review paper, we combined studies of different tumor types and found statistically significant increased risk for tumors in the brain and salivary gland after 1,000 hours of cumulative call time. The odds ratio was 1.60. Our systematic review was by no means unique. 4 other systematic reviews and meta-analyses and several other review papers published in peer-reviewed journals since 2016 also found substantial evidence of an association between long-term heavy cell phone use and brain tumor risk. Hence, due to organizations like ICNIRP and IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the scientific controversy over the health risks of RF radiation is likely to continue for some time. Meanwhile, our exposure to radiation is likely to increase exponentially due to employment of many more wireless devices and the infrastructure to support them. ICBE EMF's first paper recommended ALARA, A-L-A-R-A, which means that RF radiation exposure should be kept as low as reasonably achievable. For safety tips on how to reduce wireless radiation exposure, see my website, saferemr.com, which includes a link to cell phone safety guidance issued by the California Department of Public Health and other organizations' safety tips. To reduce the risk of harm, individuals should adopt the following behaviors. First, minimize your use of cell phones and cordless phones. Use a landline whenever possible. Second, distance is your friend. Keep your phone 10 inches from your body as compared to 1/10 of an inch results in a 10,000-fold reduction in exposure, inverse square of the distance. So keep your phone away from your head and body. Store your phone in a purse or backpack, and text or use a wired headset or speakerphone for calls. Third, cell phones are programmed to increase radiation when reception is poor by a factor of up to 10,000 times, in fact. Thus, use your phone only when the signal is strong. Avoid using it in an elevator or in a vehicle as metal structures interfere with the signal. Finally, turn off the wireless devices at bedtime, including your Wi-Fi router. Better yet, use wired connections, not Wi-Fi. Cabled, Ethernet, or optical fiber are faster, more secure, and safer than 4G or 5G. In conclusion, I believe that we are guinea pigs in a massive technological experiment that threatens our health. Our government must fund the research needed to determine a safe level of wireless radiation exposure and strengthen the FCC's radio frequency exposure limits. In the meantime, the government should impose a moratorium on technologies that increase our wireless radiation exposure, especially to new forms of wireless radiation like 5G. Here are some resources which appear on this slide with links, and finally, my contact information. Thank you for listening to this, and I hope you have some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moskowitz. There are lots of questions listed in the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and talk about a few of those now. And you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen now. Yeah, great. Okay, let me start with a question related to the status of the research. The question says, if cell phone technology has changed so much over the years, how can epidemiological studies be expected to find true risk when the variables are not consistent over time? Does this bias all the epidemiological studies towards the null?
That's an excellent question. That's my opinion too, that all these studies are biased toward the null, the cohort studies as well as the case control studies. It's really problematic to assess the exposures without a true dosimeter. There have been some recent attempts to build dosimeters into people's cell phones, but still this will only capture a limited amount of the exposure to radio frequency radiation that a person is exposed to on a daily basis. So it's really problematic to do this research. The other big problem is there's no such thing as a control group anymore because everyone's exposed. Virtually everyone is a cell phone user from an early age onward. So it's really difficult and challenging to do human research on this topic. I think we have to develop better animal models and maybe in vitro models to study which forms of the radiation are most harmful and which are safer and help us develop safe exposure limits. Thank you for that question.
Great, thank you. And then I see another question that is a little bit similar thematically. This has to do with exposure assessment. So this question says, did any of the studies look at exposure when holding phones as opposed to talking on them?
Not that I'm aware of. I think they typically look at ever versus never, regular use, which is defined once a week for 6 months, which is hardly use at all. Time since start of first use, or the cumulative call time measure, which seems to be the most sensitive in terms of overall exposure, but not in terms of just how much time you spend not talking on the phone, holding the phone near various organs of your body. I'm not aware of any studies of that offhand.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that certainly seems like a major research gap.
There are a lot of research gaps, unfortunately.
Yes,
because,
yeah.
And the U.S. has been particularly negligent in not studying this there's much more research coming out of Mediterranean countries. China and even Northern Europe is doing a lot more research than we are. The other thing, too, is there's a lot of research going on outside the U.S. looking at therapeutic effects of very short-term, very controlled exposures to RF radiation. And there's a lot of potential there for actually reducing tumors and also for bone health and other possible benefits, which we're missing out on by and large by not funding this kind of research. The NCI recently held a conference on bioelectricity, so perhaps it's getting interested in the therapeutic aspects and potential for this form of radiation.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, here's a question on a different angle. Other than human health effects, can you comment on any adverse effects for either plants or animals?
There's a lot of adverse effects on plants, animals, insects, microorganisms. I have a slide that summarizes that, and I have a lot of information on my website that summarizes the variety of effects that have been observed. There's been quite a few studies on wildlife. Many deleterious effects. And in fact, some of these like antennas that beam up to satellites, animals are attracted to them because they tend to generate some heat, and they may even nest in these antennas, and like dish antennas and so forth. So they're definitely getting exposed to these forms of radiation, which are anthropogenic.
Okay, thank you. You've already commented on a little bit about research needs, but I wonder if you can just say a little bit more about what you think would be done in an ideal world in terms of government investment in research on these technologies.
I think we should have a systematic research effort that's guided by experts with substantial long-term funding with the goal of trying to develop safety limits. And there is a model in California for tobacco research that's funded with a small excise tax on cigarettes that's generated a lot of important research that's guided by an advisory group and is kept independent of industry. I think that's a model that could be applied here with a simple excise tax of, even a penny. A wireless subscription would generate $50 million a year for education and training and research. Given the massive amount of money that's spent on this technology that we all spend on this highly useful but highly addictive technology, I don't think people would notice the difference of a penny a month for a wireless subscription. And that could be enough to jumpstart a lot of investigation that's driven toward the end of developing a much safer technology. Also, if the industry were to get more responsible, they could adopt some simple changes to reduce the exposures substantially as is. But they're not so motivated currently till I guess there's consumer demand. They won't behave responsibly, or government regulation.
Great, yeah, thank you. Can you comment a little more on those changes that could be made voluntarily to either the software or the hardware?
Sure. Well, for one thing, the cell phone, smartphone is constantly checking in with the cell tower. If the phone doesn't move, why does it have to keep checking in? They could develop the technology to only check in to send that beacon signal out once the phone is moved from place to place. When the phone's stationary, there's no need to keep beaming the tower. and exposing the user to the radiation. There's also ways of reducing the exposure through proximity sensors and so forth from the cell phone. Some of that technology, the industry has patents for most of these ideas, but they just don't implement a lot of them.
Okay, it's very helpful. Thank you. Here's another question that was submitted. Can you please discuss the overall reduction in cell phone power through the transition from analog signals to digital signals and how this affects the overall doses and hazards?
The general belief is that the exposure has been reduced considerably as we move from analog to later forms of digital. This 2G GSM, which was very popular outside the US, and in the US it represented about half of the cell phone users, had really poor adaptive power control. Subsequent to that generation of phones, the adaptive power control has been much better, but it's still all dependent upon the signal strength from the cell tower. So if you have a weak signal, your phone is putting out maybe thousands of times more radiation than when it has a strong signal. We need to do something to figure out how to solve this problem of great variability in exposure. The other thing with 5G too is you're getting these peak exposures that are massive due to the technology employed in 5G, and they exceed the current assumptions under the current exposure limit guidelines in many instances, and that's believed to be highly problematic by many of my colleagues. These peak exposures may be more important in terms of the harm to our health than the averaged exposures that are used to test and certify these cell phones. Furthermore, holding the phone next to your body, you can often exceed the FCC exposure limits. The FCC and CTIA has won a case in court saying that basically the only one who can talk about this issue is the FCC. Other governments can't advise their citizens and residents about how to handle the cell phone safely. Yet when the phones are tested, they're typically tested not right against the body, but with a separation distance, which could be up to 25 millimeters, roughly an inch. So there's a real problem there that the courts have not really resolved in a way that favors public health, but favors the regulatory agency.
Okay. All right, we're just 2 minutes to the hour. Let's go ahead and do at least one more question before we wrap up. Here's a question that says, are there any countries or any place at all that have instituted limitations that seem okay or great? Where can I find those good recommendations?
Great question. There are some countries in Eastern Europe, particularly Italy, has stronger exposure limits for far field or far away exposures. However, they're reversing themselves. There's a push by the industry to loosen these regulations. The industry wants to make common regulations everywhere. China and Russia, my understanding is they have much stronger exposure limits, but we've never been able to determine whether they actually enforce them. So I have a link on my website to a lot of information about RF exposure limits around the world. WHO also has a lot of information on that. So there are nations, particularly China and Russia, who have much, much stronger limits. But as I said, I don't know to what extent they're actually enforced or not. The industry doesn't like stronger limits because that limits their ability to promote particularly the 5G technology. So they're pushing very strongly in those countries, the Eastern European countries and Italy, that have stronger limits than we do. Also, India has a stronger limit than we do for these cell tower exposures. but the industry doesn't like this and is pushing very hard to relax these limits.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time, and there are many questions still left in the Q&A. I think we'll check with Dr. Moskowitz afterwards to see if there might be any others that we can answer over email, but we'll have to stop there for now. So I want to thank all of you so much for these excellent questions that you've submitted. And Dr. Moskowitz, thank you so much for this presentation and for all your really important work on this topic. Just to wrap up, I will let you know that a video recording will be available on Che's website soon, and you will all receive an email with a link to the video. So we again would like to thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Moskowitz, thank you so much for all of your important work, and also a big thanks to Che Director Kristen Schaefer for all of her help behind the scenes.
Thank you for having me, and please check out my website, saferemr.com, as it will probably answer any remaining questions you might have.
Great. Thanks again.